Ilya, you're on air.
Okay, thank you very much. So we are here with Professor Patterson, professor at Fordham Law School and teaching at a number of other law schools, including NYU and Bocconi, as far as I know. And our talk is about antitrust, of course. So the first item is hipster antitrust, which is, of course, is the talk of the day for people, for antitrust maniacs like we are. And what I can see is that hipster antitrust is really very much about what it used to be called the political content of antitrust. And of course, this means that skeptics, which are quite a few, would say, and do say, that this this way to approach antitrust is too vague and too dangerous and too open-ended, and that there is no salvation outside the consumer welfare standard. And hipsters, or Brandesians, reply that actually there are other standards like competitive process, which is actually a European standard, and that some of the old categories of antitrust, such as predation or vertical integration, can be adapted to this new problems that antitrust is having right now. And that in any event, this is what antitrust was all about when it was invented, and when it still was at that time a hipster thing, like in the Standard Oil case or in the Roosevelt area and so on.
Or Hamilton.
And that after all, this consumer welfare standard is not so precise as its supporters pretend, and that after all, even if we don't have a precise formula that runs everything in antitrust, this is not going to be a major problem vis-a-vis the advantages of this new/old approach. So we are very much interested in knowing your views on this.
Yeah, I think there are people, some people have said I belong in the hipster camp, but I'm not one that thinks we should think of it as antitrust as a political tool. I think there are the people who feel like antitrust is not doing its job, and that's a broad class of people not doing its job in the US. And then there are a narrower class of people that I think the hipster epithet has been applied to.
Yeah, because it was meant to be like a criticism to call them hipsters, but actually I think they sort of like it.
Well, there's a nice piece out now by Harry First that talks about Woodstock antitrust on the short piece. And so he, because everybody loves Woodstock, he lays claim to being a particular sort of hipster. But I think those of us who are concerned that antitrust is not doing its job think that the consumer welfare standard really ends up meaning price, and price isn't enough these days. Price has become, I think, less important than a lot of people would think, and it's more about choice or non-price components of competition, and to bring those into play, even though everybody, I think, agrees in theory that those things should be part of antitrust, they just end up not being part of antitrust because it's too difficult to do under the current approaches. And so I think, to some extent, the hipster push is to let's think more broadly. And for some of us, it's not about getting out of what antitrust traditionally means and moving into politics as much as it is let's just try to loosen up what we think of as consumer welfare and be a little more and just have a little bit broader definition and application of that. And then there are the people who are focused on the political issues. And there's probably not a lot of commonality among the people who are focused on the political issues and those of us who want a broader antitrust but don't want I personally feel like you don't want to let antitrust become a fix-all either, because I do think there is some content and precision. Precision is probably too strong, but at least focus that's gained by focusing on consumer welfare in a broader sense.
Thank you. Moving on, two of the main issues that modern antitrust faces are, as question issues to deal with, are the spread of artificial intelligence and the so-called big data phenomenon. And there are a number of antitrust problems which stem from this, but I would just for the moment concentrate on discrimination, because discrimination in a way poses an almost philosophical dilemma to antitrust. I mean, by discrimination, of course, we mean the fact that this amount of information enables certain operators to almost perfectly discriminate between each consumer based on taste and records and history and whatever. I mean, eyeball movements, whatever. Now, of course, many consumers don't like this, don't like the idea that you would pay a different price for an airplane ticket than I pay in just a few seconds before you. But the question is this an antitrust problem? And if it is, can sort of regular antitrust deal with it? There is a rather famous, rightly or not famous article by Ezraki and Stuckey, who suggested that the economic problem that discrimination creates is the problem of distrust, that consumers come to distrust these operators, which usually are platforms, but can be lots of things, lots of different things, and that this creates an overall inefficiency in the way the market works. I'm not so convinced that this standard is going to carry the day, but I would like to know from you whether you think that, again, antitrust is capable of dealing with these problems, and if so, if you see any particular tools that should be used to deal with them.
Sure, I think antitrust is capable of dealing with the problem. I don't think there's any very strong likelihood that we will do that in the US. I think at least in the EU, price discrimination is part of the statutes. In the it is in the US too, but it's only part of a discredited or arguably discredited statute, the Robinson-Pavan Act. So I don't think people are inclined to broaden any enforcement efforts against price discrimination. But yeah, I don't like it when I pay more than somebody else for the same good, and I don't know that I would cast it in.
But do you think this is a problem that antitrust should deal with?
Antitrust is
price, but it can be other things too.
Sure, but it could be. But even if you focus on consumer welfare, it's only if you look at total welfare that price discrimination is not a problem. If you care about consumer welfare, then price discrimination is a problem. I actually worry as much about what I have called information discrimination as I do about price discrimination. The idea that if you're a platform, for example, not so much say the airlines which you refer to, but if you're a platform that you can deliver different information to different people, and then everybody is making decisions on a different basis. And ultimately, it might be that what that amounts to is price discrimination if one person pays more than another. But it can also, I think, have exclusionary effects. And so to the extent that you can divide consumers up and you can be selective about who gets better deals and who gets worse deals, it makes it more difficult for competitors to come in. And so I think that form of discrimination can have, as price discrimination can have too.
I've recently read something about this, I don't know how you call it, these electronic butlers that platforms are producing where they choose for you in a way that you...
Right. Well, and more, people I don't have one of these things, but more and more people in the US do. And I don't know whether they're as common in Europe as they are in the US, but...
Certainly not in Italy. In some countries like the UK and Germany, they are catching up.
Yeah. And so I think we just haven't fully understood probably the short-term, but certainly the long-term effects that these things can have. So yeah, I think antitrust should take this stuff seriously. And I think that's an example of the sort of thing that some people who might be labeled as hipster antitrust people care about. Maybe not for reasons of trust per se, but as an element of what can determine consumer welfare and the competitive process, or just more straightforward exclusion in antitrust. So I think we could and should do something about it.
Okay. In a recent interview with Luigi Zingales, Judge Posner, one of the big names in antitrust, historically speaking, posed the question, half jokingly, of whether antitrust is dead. And then if you listen to the interview, you understand that he means that that some platforms, such as Microsoft or Google or Amazon, are becoming or are on the way of becoming monopolies, but they work in a very efficient way, both in terms of quality and in terms of price. So I think what it means, again, half jokingly, but probably not so much, is that it is evident that we should not deal with them in antitrust terms, and that this, in a way, makes antitrust appear empty or moot, because, again, it's taboo to deal with monopolies, but in this area, monopolies are, after all, absolutely not a bad thing. So, what do you think about that? I mean, should we put aside antitrust as such an important part of our economies, or is just Patterson there making fun of all of us? Or
well, he does do that sometimes, but they are efficient and they do provide great services at low prices or no prices. But I think that's mostly in the core market. And so outside of the core market, when you think about acquisitions of competing or sort of complementary products, it's not so clear that having a Google or an Amazon in the market is a good thing. It's, there are concerns, has been stated by competitors and potential competitors in those markets that having those firms there and depending on them actually is a deterrent to investing in those markets. And so we might get less innovation in the related markets in a way that is not good. So I guess I'm not, I don't know that I would be an advocate for splitting up these firms or something dramatic like that, but I would be more concerned, or I am more concerned about some of the acquisitions that these firms have made, that Facebook has made of WhatsApp, and that Google has made of Waze and DoubleClick, that I think maybe would have been better not permitted and would have allowed for more competition sort of on the complementary periphery of these firms, I guess. And I noticed that Eric Posner, Judge Posner's son, has just written a big op-ed in the New York Times saying we need to do much more. So I don't know whether that makes holidays difficult in the Posner household, or maybe it makes them good. So maybe they're in agreement. It's difficult to tell what Judge Posner thinks.
It's difficult to say if he was making fun of everyone or he was serious about it. But of course he has a point. He was saying, everyone would say, if you go on an interview, he was telling everybody that he uses Google a lot in his own judicial decisions, that he Googles things, and that this actually poses another problem. I mean, because the adversarial principle is that you just stick to the facts that you
right.
And he thinks this is nonsense. So I mean, there are all kind of interesting problems there which go much beyond antitrust. So let's move shortly to the EU. I mean, the biggest cases of the last 10 years at the EU level have been Microsoft, Intel, and Google, not to mention GE Honeywell. So my question to you is the EU, you think, politically biased in just attacking the American winners, or?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I don't think most antitrust people think so. Even in the U.S., I think that there are people, in the business community that might think that. I mean, it seems to me that the question is more obvious question is not so much why is Europe doing this, but why is the US not doing this? Well, one could suggest that there's a political bias in favor of US companies, which is why the US, enforcers are not doing this. I don't think that's it either. I just think that that the US has traditionally had a more cautious attitude towards government intervention, say, and so that because all of these firms present issues that are new and challenging, I don't think it's that surprising that Europe would go first on these issues. It's not just Europe. I mean, Europe, a lot of enforcement efforts in Asia too, and so. So I think it might be just that the U.S. is more cautious by nature than that there's any sort of political difference here. But to some extent, we are potentially able to free ride off Europe, right? To the extent that Europe imposes new rules on Google, it's quite likely that Google might just adopt those rules. So we could be just saving money on our enforcement efforts by outsourcing this all to Europe.
Right. So
it
it's all up to EU antitrust, and also the Chinese. They have their own way of dealing with the giants, like Facebook. Okay, you are an antitrust professor, and you are a professor, and in Italy we have a lot of admiration for the US academic system, including because we think that this system not only produces wonders and plenty of Nobel Prizes, but because we think that we see it as a meritocratic system, which is more than we can say about most of what is happening in the Italian academic system. But, recently, this is obviously just an example, Peter Thiel, who, by the way, has no resentment, I think, towards the academic system, because as far as I know, he went first to Stanford and then to Harvard Law School, so he clearly did quite well. He funded a scholarship for young brilliant minds to help them not to go into college at all, because basically he thinks that colleges and even more, schools such as law schools are an incredible waste of time and money, irrespective of the quality. Actually, the more procedures, in his view, are even more a waste of money. And so my question to you, as someone who is immersed in the U.S. academic system, is whether this is a new problem, or whether this is a problem which is posed by the way that the labor market and the economy now works. Do you think there exists a problem with the U.S. academic world, and let's say law schools, if we want to just to focus to an area of it, which makes them either obsolete or inadequate, and which requires some kind of drastic reformation, or are things going splendidly anyway, as we see from outside?
Yeah, I don't think things are going splendidly, I guess. But I think it's basically fine. I think that to the extent that I think there's a problem, I might share some of Thiel's views, which are that I think that the political views among academics are too uniformly left. I'm pretty left myself, but we have an underrepresentation of more conservative attitudes, which is, I think, not good for anyone, not good for the left, not good for, obviously, I guess, but not good for the right. But I've also talked, I heard these claims about particularly colleges. My wife is a college counselor in India, so she advises students on where might be good schools, and her take on it is that there's just it's not so much that the elite schools don't do good work, it's that the students that get there have been so forced into a mold of trying to check off all the boxes that they need, that they have lost a lot of what otherwise might be creativity and individuality. They focused on doing so many things and to add things to their resume, and it's probably true that when they get to college, or to law school, they don't. It doesn't help. I don't know that colleges and universities and law schools are that good at breaking students out of the mold that they're in when they get there. But I'm not sure that they're responsible for the output of college, of universities and law schools either entirely. Some of it depends on what the input is. And the input for particularly elite institutions is a fairly narrow range of types of preparation that the students have.
One of the arguments that Thiel is making is, if Harvard Law School is so good, why, and I mean, you might agree or disagree, but let's just take Harvard to make things simple, why instead of accepting, a few hundred students per year at $100,000 per year, why don't they accept 1,000 at 30,000? I mean, I think he is making a kind of almost antitrust argument in the sense that this schools keep tuitions artificially high, and they're choking the system by doing that.
Yeah, I don't know that I think that. It depends on what you mean by artificially high. Higher than it needs to be, I suppose. But it's not clear that there's any sort of any conscious goal to that, let alone collusion or something. I think that it's just the way schools have developed. Particularly in the U.S., there's so much more emphasis with competition on providing all sorts of services to students, and so a lot of studies show that the largest increase in college tuition is really from staff, not from academics, and so and I'm not sure that if you're Harvard, I'm sure that if you are Harvard, you don't want to expand your faculty, and therefore cheapen the prestige of being a Harvard professor, which might suggest that Thiel has some, element of wisdom there, but it's not an antitrust issue. It's not something we don't tell people how they have to run their business.
Yeah. I mean, Thiel is not making an antitrust issue.
No,
I was just raising it, but probably stupidly. Now, one more question about academics, which is, this difficult relationship between, the outside world and the world of academics, which in our field, law, it's obviously a very sensitive issue because the overlap between practice and teaching can be very tempting in many ways. And I mean, in the German system, for instance, as a professor, you are prohibited from being a lawyer. In the US system, go figure, but my impression is that you cannot do both at the time, although there is this revolving door policy by which you can, most professors have actually been lawyers in their life, and some of them go back, and anyway you can advise, and maybe you can plead in prestigious cases in the Supreme Court, I don't know. In Italy, there are certain rules, of course, but basically you can opt for being a kind of professor who, once he or she has dealt with his requirements in terms of teaching and exams and theses, as we call it, graduations and so on, he or she can be a lawyer as much as they want. Now, this of course poses problems in terms of time that you can dedicate to research, and this also poses some kind of ethical problems, because of course there are issues that you deal with in your academic life which might have a very high economic content, and actually some of those that we briefly dealt with in our conversation may fall into this category. So in your experience, is there a perfect formula which might sort of work in the best interest of research and also of students, or is it just very imperfect world?
Well, I don't think there's something that's going to be in the best interest of giving students sort of the benefits of practice experience and of more concentration on academic. I think in the antitrust area particularly, a lot of professors do some sort of consulting work, which I think from time to time at least, and I think that gives you, particularly if you're in a case for a long period of time, rather than say just writing an expert report, which there's not that much of in antitrust for lawyers, though there's a lot for economists, of course. I think it can give you a much better sense of how litigation actually works, and or counseling for that matter, and that's a good thing. I mean, I certainly have colleagues, not in the antitrust area, that don't seem to have a realistic view of how practice works. And we are professional schools, and so I think that's a problem. But it's hard because in Europe, my sense is, from reading a lot of the scholarship, that the scholarship is more practice-oriented, much of it. And in the U.S.,
Yeah,
in the U.S. it's not, and much of it isn't, although more in antitrust than in other areas. And so, the kinds of things that promote your career in certain respects are not practice-oriented things. And I have colleagues who are quite clear that they don't want us to be a professional school. They want to see law school as an academic enterprise, more akin to producing PhDs. Yeah, and that's not my view, but and so I think the U.S. I would prefer to be able to do more practice work personally, as opposed to just consulting work, just because it's fun, and there are cases I would like to see brought that aren't brought. Since I'm largely pro-enforcement, I would, be interested in bringing cases, but it's hard to manage the time. And I've actually, in the last year or two, been seeking to try to figure out how could I do this, maybe being a counsel at a firm, but still it's difficult to manage the time. It's something that I might do after retirement, for example. And so I think the U.S. I think having some of both is a good thing. And I don't have enough experience with, say, being on the non-podium side of classes in Italy to know what I think, a significant practice involvement has in that respect. I do have enough experience to think that more practice or consulting experience would be good in the U.S. for many academics.
Okay. Now, one of the several interesting things about you is that you don't do only antitrust. You, as a law professor, you deal with a number of different areas, sometimes areas which have connections with antitrust, sometimes possibly even not. So my question to you is that we all consider that antitrust, at least in the abstract, is a very intellectually stimulating area of law, and it's actually quite fun. So did you, in your experience, find any other area of law which is as much fun and is as interesting, intellectually speaking, as antitrust?
In law?
Maybe,
not in law.
In law.
And so outside of law, there are things that I find as interesting and fun. But in no, I don't think so. I do think, for me personally, and I don't think this is true for too many of my antitrust colleagues in the U.S., that it gets. I've been doing this now for 20 some years, and it's a little frustrating, I think, to look at the antitrust landscape in the U.S. and to feel that this is getting back to the hipster question, to feel that we're not doing as much as we should to keep the U.S. economy working as well as it could for people. And so it's not that I don't find it, it's not that I no longer find it intellectually stimulating. I don't find that I just don't feel that the stimulation of putting forward another approach pays off on the ground. anymore as much as I would like it to. And the whole hipster movement, not so much specifics of it, but the idea that, and I shouldn't even be calling it the hipster movement because it is such a pejorative kind of characterization, but the idea that we need to do something, that it isn't working now, actually gives me some hope that it might become enlivened and do some of the tasks that a lot of us think it should be doing. But it hasn't been in the last, 10 years. And so, it's only so long that you can find it intellectually stimulating and write articles and see not that much happen. And after a time, you like to do a little bit more. And so I do contract law, for example, and I think some of the issues that arise in contract law are very interesting, also frustrating, but I think that in terms of, say, exploitation and some consumer debt issues. So I would, I've toyed with the idea of switching over to a more, what we would call more like consumer protection in the US and doing consumer debt work or even consumer debt litigation, because I've done some pro bono work in that area, and you just see that there are people who are just being miserably exploited, and it's a problem that I don't see an immediate solution to, but I would feel happier if I were doing something myself more than just occasional pro bono cases in that area.
Thank you. So we've come to the last question, which is sort of almost on the personal side. And I mean, I can see that you keep coming back to Italy, which obviously is something that we very much appreciate. And so my question to you is, besides presumably pleasant atmosphere and good food and nice weather, is there anything in particular that attracts you to Italy?
So I guess I could ask this to you at the US, because I know you've spent time there too.
Yeah.
But yeah, those are all great things. They would be enough. What do I like about Italy? I like the Italian sense of humor for the most part. I mean, I read books in Italian. I enjoy the attitude. I think mostly what I like is I think that in the US we get the big picture right. I mean, I feel like, at least until recently, we've been a pretty well-run country. But when you come to Italy, it's just, there's so many, maybe the big picture's got problems, you're right at this moment, but there's so many, the little things are all done so spectacularly well that, and I was an engineer before I went to law school, and so I care about all the little design things that I see in Italy that I just don't see in the US. And maybe there are things that are related, maybe because the US has this push towards efficiency and the size. I think efficiency and charm are sort of antithetical principles to some extent. We're pretty efficient, we're not that charming. And so I think Italy is very, very charming, even if not always efficient.
Mark, thank you very much.
Thank you
really for giving us the time to do this.